Good afternoon. This is Eric with the Office of Community and Rural Affairs. This is our Broadband 101 educational webinar, and we are going to go over some general topics related to broadband. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to our partner at the Purdue Center for Regional Development, Roberto. Roberto, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Today we're going to go over a topic that I'm very passionate about. I work for Purdue Extension and the Purdue Center for Regional Development. Like Eric said, please hold your questions towards the end. I'm going to rush you a couple of slides due to the delay, but hopefully we will have plenty of time to address any questions that you may have. This is an overview of what broadband is and what the digital age is, what is broadband, and more specifically, what are the implications for community economic development. After this webinar, you should have a better idea of what broadband is, how it is affecting the community economic development landscape, and some key terminology and broadband technologies for you to be a little bit more knowledgeable about the topic as you gear up for your community's broadband planning process. So again, I'm going to start with just an overview of what the digital age is, what are the implications, then we're going to switch to what is broadband, and then I'm going to share with you some of the resources that we have available here and with Extension and PCRD. So just quickly, here's the Internet back in 1969. It connected 4 universities. Obviously, that's much bigger now, but that's always good to kind of share the context of where it was, 50 years ago. In the 1960s, it was called the ARPANET, is launched. In the 1970s, the Ethernet and TCP/IP. That basically means those were the protocols to transfer data over phone lines. Then in the 80s, domain name system came to being, where you would have a website or you would have an address online. And then in the 90s, the World Wide Web as we know it made its debut with the HTMLs and other stuff. And then now this technology has evolved to provide very sophisticated online applications, or also called cloud-based. So I always like to share this slide to put it into perspective. So just so you can have an idea of how quickly digital applications are being adopted, this slide shows the amount of time that it took to reach 100 million users worldwide. It took the telephone 75 years. Of course, most of those years were because of the wiring that was needed to connect people, but still it took 75 years. The mobile phone, it took 16. The World Wide Web, it took 7. Facebook, it took 4. Instagram, it took 2. And Pokemon Go, it took 1 month to reach 100 million users worldwide. So you can see the number of years is decreasing quickly. And this has tremendous implications. I'll come back to that later. But pay attention to that last one, that Pokemon Go. It's a very interesting technology that I'm going to share a little bit more about. This image is very powerful. It shows the Vatican when Pope John Paul II died. And then 8 years later, it shows the same area when Pope Francis was about to give his first speech as Pope. You can see there the tremendous difference between the screens. Of course, one has a bunch of little screens, the other one does not. Though do not be that harsh, because there is a flip phone on the lower right in that 2005 image of what was happening then. So this kind of summarizes this adoption trend. We don't know exactly what the digital age is. As a researcher, it's not set in stone yet, but we do know it has 4 characteristics. So I'm going to share the first one with you. It has exponential behavior, especially on the hardware side of things, and now it's moving over to the software side. So this is population. This is world population. This is the textbook example of what an exponential curve looks like, in case you don't like math. It starts really slow, does not move, and then it hits an inflection point and it takes off. That's kind of what has happened with hardware and now with software. Let me show you a couple videos to kind of showcase what I'm talking about with this exponential behavior. This is a robot. In 2015, it's a series of robots, obviously. Okay, and this is 2 years later. Obviously, that's a different robot, but the software and the hardware behind it are growing and improving at an exponential rate, as well as adoption and other stuff. So this kind of showcases one of the characteristics. The second characteristic is obviously everything is digital. The physical world can now be digitized, monitored, measured, and optimized. And so this is changing everything. This is leading to what it's being called big data. It is expected that 50 billion devices will be connected to the Internet by 2020. Just to put it into perspective, it's about 7.5 billion of us humans. So it's going to be at least 4 times that. The Internet of Everything is a 19 trillion global opportunity over the next decade. That was 5 years ago, so we're halfway through that mark. And if everything goes well and everything works out fine, there are a lot of challenges that I'm going to cover later on, the Internet of Everything alone could add up to $11 trillion to the U.S. economy per year, starting in 2025. So, what amount of those dollars will go into your communities? That's a question you've got to start asking now. The third characteristic, of course, it's that it is disruptive, right? It is disrupting everything left and right. It is all about a mindset, however, of how to exploit these digital platforms for multiple purposes. But in the end, you can interact digitally with consumers and residents. Mostly everyone has the tools to market, test, refine, and eventually disrupt an industry. Again, this is Industry 1.0 brought us the web, and with it, it changed how we access information. Internet 2.0 brought us e-commerce and social media, and with it, it changed how we communicate and how we shop. Internet 3.0 is on its head-on collision to disrupt heavily regulated industries such as education and finance and transportation. So keep this in mind. That's the third characteristic. And here's an example of what I mean with the digital mindset. This is similar to a Walmart store in South Korea. They were wanting to expand, but they didn't want to build additional physical stores. So what they came up with, and this was about 7 years ago, they bought advertising space in the subway stations, and then they put pictures, as you can see there, of the products you would find in the normal aisles of a physical store. And then through a QR code that the smartphone could read, you would then purchase whatever it is you needed, and when you got home, it was being delivered. Of course, they were the number 2 store. They rose quickly to the number 1 store in the country without building an additional physical store. On the big companies, you can see again a shift. This is a graph between 2006 and 2016. The blue bars identify technology companies, while the orange bars identify energy, and the green bars is banks. You can see that over 10 years, there's only one energy company left in the top 5 or 6, and the rest are all technology companies. So this is all changing quickly. So what are the results of this? Well, we have the innovation is changing. This shows the major innovations over time. Notice how I'm going to just point out here that the agricultural revolution was invented 9,000 years before Christ, and then it took approximately 7,000 years to invent mathematics. Okay, so 7,000 years went by. And then notice what happened in the about 1700s or earlier, printing press, then the telescope, then the steam engine, and then you can see what happened after that. And notice that same graph it has an exponential behavior as well. So this is changing again. This is impacting and providing opportunities for rural communities as well, as long as they're plugged in. So what does this mean for my community? Well, first and foremost, we are in the diaper stage right now. The first industrial revolution took place when 3 main technologies or components converged: communication, energy, and transportation. Telegraph, coal, and railroad all converged, and then the first industrial revolution followed. Then the second one was, the TV, radio, and then oil, and then internal combustion engines, and we know what happened after that. Today we are here, right? Where connectivity, energy, on top of renewables, we're talking about microgrids that are going to be smart. Homes are going to be able to produce, and then share their energy with the grid. And then, of course, the driverless vehicles that you may have heard already a lot about, and drones and all other things that are coming. So, but this is just getting started. But the question is your community ready to take advantage of this? So again, the economic landscape is changing. Back in the industrial economy, geographic proximity was everything. The bigger the better, tied to an office, a factory, and mass produce everything. The trends indicate now these have not played out, but they're on their way to do so, and they may not. But these are what the trends are showing for the digital economy. A decentralization effect, economic gardening, meaning that instead of attracting outside industry, you focus inward into what you already have. Telework or work from anywhere is starting to pick up. And customizable manufacturing with 3D printers and all that, that's going to change entirely what our notion of manufacturing. So these are the things that potentially will play out in the next 10 to 15 years. But again, you've got to have that foundation at the community level to make sure that you can benefit from this. So an example of decentralization is, let me back up. The culprit of all this, it's called digital globalization, which in reality is a teenager. It's 15 years old, but yet it has a larger impact on GDP than centuries-old goods trade. So this is changing, again, the landscape. Why is this the case? Well, because now with connectivity and know-how, you're including developing countries, small companies, startups, and billions of individuals. And then we saw what's happening to the trend or the speed or the pace of innovation. So you can see that because of this, we're having a larger impact on innovation. And again, it can help rural communities because mostly anybody can participate theoretically. But again, there are barriers and issues that I'm going to cover later on. So this is what's going on. An example of decentralization is the following. So, for example, I don't know if you have used Airbnb or not. Airbnb is a platform that you can rent space in your home, or you can rent an entire home to to strangers and earn some rent money. That's basically what Airbnb does. It's all over the world. And, I mean, just imagine for a second if I would have told you 10 years ago that you would be able to rent your home or a room in your house to a total stranger using your smartphone, you would have thought I was crazy. Well, this is playing out now. This is an example of decentralization effect. So how long do you think it took Airbnb to reach 600,000 rooms? It took it 4 years. To the contrary, Hilton, the chain, the hotel chain, which is a textbook example of the 20th century mindset of centralizing and building out. That one, it took 93 years to reach 600,000 rooms. So this is just an example of that potential of the one of the characteristics of the digital age. So in summary, the digital age makes possible all these things and whatever is coming down the pipe, which I'm going to cover shortly. You can do commerce, you can do banking, you can do entertainment, education, and employment, email, which is the oldest application, information, healthcare, communication, productivity, innovation, you name it. Everything is being touched by this digital transformation. And so it's very important to keep in mind because back in the day, or many communities still have the misconception that internet is about Netflix and social media only. And in reality, it's a lot more than that, as this graph shows. What's coming up is very interesting. So this is in the 1950s. I don't know if you remember or if you ever worked with punch cards. That's the kind of basically the size of a computer that would take to process these punch cards. That happened in the 50s. Who would benefit from this technology? Well, it was a very few people, really. It was not very user-friendly, as you can see, who was going to be punching cards left and right to get whatever they needed. Plus, the processing power of the computers were not the best. Then came the 70s, and then you had these text terminals. So typing in text was slightly easier than punching cards. So you could see here that the number of users increased, and with it, the number of applications and knowledge and innovations that came with that because of these text screens. Then we have in the 80s, that's actually the first Windows operating system that came out. Of course, it's more user-friendly, and now you have more users, adoption increases, and with that, uses and applications and other innovations and knowledge creation followed. Then in the 2000s, of course, we are tapping away, right, with all our phones, and it makes it even easier to interact with the technology. You just saw how quickly it is being adopted. So this, again, expands the number of users, and with that, the knowledge creation and the innovation. What's coming up is called mixed reality, which is a combination of augmented reality and virtual reality. So check out this video from a high school gym showcasing a technology. So that's what futurists are saying is next. In fact, it's already here. Remember that Pokemon Go that I asked you to remember? That was a very crude version of this. We're going to now be able to overlay digital layers into our reality. That's called augmented reality, or we can just submerge ourselves into a virtual reality ecosystem. Imagine what this technology is going to do to education or healthcare or workforce development. So that's what's coming, and the number of users, again, will explode, and with it, its applications and knowledge and new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what's coming up. The glasses that make this possible is on the upper right of the slide, and that the debut was not as a big bang as everybody was expecting, but we can, we should expect kind of not moving that quickly, but going backwards occasionally. Now, if you're asking, I will never, ever wear those glasses. Well, do you remember this? This is the first cell phone, right? And again, remember that exponential curve with the hardware. That's what it was now, and look what we have now. So when you look at those glasses and you go, I'm not using that, we don't know what's going to end up being in the next 5 or 10 years. It's going to be a lot less intrusive for sure. So don't judge too quickly. I think we're going to get there sooner rather than later. So the digital economy it's a moving target. Again, everything is being impacted, but the Bureau of Economic Analysis came up with its first attempt to measure it. I think it's very conservative, personally, but it's still, as researchers, we're starting to get a better gauge of what's going on with the digital economy. According to this study done by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, it comprised of 6.5% of the U.S. GDP, or 1.2 trillion 3 years ago in 2016. But notice at the bottom, the average annual compensation of digital economy workers, it's $114,000. That's a little bit less than double of what the median household income is in the U.S. at $60,000. So you can see that this is taking place. And here's the kicker, though. You do not necessarily have to be in those big metro urban areas to benefit from this. But again, you have to have certain pieces in place to benefit from this. That's just getting started, and I believe this is a very conservative estimate. But again, it's a moving target, and it's being worked on to better fine-tune this measurement. Another implication for economic development, specifically for rural communities that I've been working with over the past 15 years, is its impact in manufacturing. This graph shows the manufacturing productivity is the blue line. From 1980 to 2015, the red line shows manufacturing employment. You can see how it has plateaued or even decreased a little bit. And then the gray bar in the background is the number of jobs needed to generate a $1 million output. In 1980, it was 25 workers. In 2015, it was 6.5 workers. So if your strategy as a rural community is still to attract manufacturing, you're now competing with countries around the world, number one. But number two, if you are serious about it, do those 6.5 workers have the necessary skills? These are very high tech-savvy employees that you need to have. So you've got to start rethinking your workforce development efforts at the county or at the local level to make sure that you have the workers so that companies may relocate to your facility. Only focusing on the workers, there are other criteria, but this is a very telling slide of how it's impacting the traditional manufacturing economic development model. Again, workforce development, according to McKinsey Global Institute, 1/3 of U.S. workers will have to switch occupational categories within 11 years. The reason for that is automation. And so, again, does your workforce development programs, are they ready for this? Are you planning for this? That's very important to keep in mind. Because also, middle and digital skills, middle skills are those occupations. Middle skill jobs are those that don't typically require a bachelor's degree, but they do pay above the national living wage. So according to this study, 46% of jobs out there are middle skill, right? And of these 46%, 82% require digital skills, up from 4%. So it's important, again, are you teaching your workers digital skills? Because if you're not, they're almost automatically missing out on half of the jobs that are available out there. So that's something you've got to keep in mind as well from a workforce development perspective. So this brings us to digital inclusion, which is broader than broadband, okay? So I'm going to circle back, and then we're getting ready to discuss broadband itself. But before we do that, digital inclusion has these 5 dimensions when it's a robust strategy. Typically, we talk about point number 1, right? Is there broadband? Is it affordable? It is an important thing. I'm not saying it's not. But you've got to keep in mind that for it to have the impact that you're hoping, you've got to really focus on the other 4 dimensions as well to ensure that people in your communities really benefit and leverage this technology to improve their quality of life. So these are the 5 dimensions. Purdue Extension and others can help tremendously with these other 4 dimensions. Number 1, obviously, is the one that everybody talks about and focuses mostly. But I just wanted to make you aware that it is a large, broader ecosystem that you've got to contemplate for the technology to really have an impact in the quality of life of your communities. Another concept that we're pushing is digital parity. Urban and is ahead of us. Ahead of us is in rural communities. We do have to start working on changing our mindset from that industrial age mindset to a digital age mindset is the first step we need to do. On infrastructure-wise, we have to make sure that rural is at the same pace and the same quality and affordability and service that urban communities enjoy, and then obviously the literacy and skills. When this happens, I have no question in my mind that rural communities will truly leverage and participate fully in this digital age. Until then, however, it is a challenge. And so this project through OCRA is great because it's focusing on the infrastructure side of things primarily, which is good, is one of the things. But if the community does not have the mindset, then you won't be able to truly leverage that infrastructure, and you won't focus on literacy and skills as well. An application that is gaining steam is telework. These are numbers from a study. Millennials are particularly attracted to this. And I'm not talking about Uber and the gig economy. This is actual telework, working as an entrepreneur, as a freelancer, or working for Amazon, but you're working here in Indiana, right? Or you're working for Microsoft, or working for other companies. There are a lot of companies that are starting to look at teleworkers, and you don't have to necessarily move to the urban area. However, do you have the skills and the connectivity? That's a key thing that U.S. community leaders need to address. Another big thing coming is healthcare plus the smartphone. There is a great book called The Patient Will See You Now that argues that what the printing press did to knowledge, the smartphone will do to healthcare. We don't know if it's going to play out or not, but definitely I think this will help, especially older generations that tend to adopt at a later time the technology. I think this will bring them online quickly. This will make them adopters as well. And when you think about it, I believe broadband is a common thread between younger and older generations in any community, because younger generations can benefit from telework and online courses. They don't necessarily would have to leave their community, which is why they do, right, for education and jobs. And on the other hand, older residents tend to leave because of health care. So if this plays out, this will have a tremendous impact, especially on the adoption side of elderly residents. And then, of course, Precision Ag, which, farmers are early adopters. We all know that. This is picking up, gaining steam as well. It's moving quickly. There's multiple projects that I know of here in Purdue looking at this precise technology. But again, if our farms are not adequately connected, they're going to miss out on this new technology. Well, it's been around. The GPS farming has been around since the 90s or early 2000s. So, but it's adding sensors and it's adding a lot of stuff that is increasing productivity, but more importantly, it's making our farmers competitive. So moving forward as a community, and I applaud because you as a community identified broadband as an issue, hence you applied and were selected for this program, but you do need an update community-wide, especially on the mindset type of things. On the economic development strategy, I'm not saying to totally ignore attracting industries, but do be mindful of what you already have in the community. So we need an update, right? We have to change the way we see things. Another example is this question that I get a lot, right? Do I need faster internet? I think to me is like asking, do I need electricity when I use candles? Now, nobody envisioned what electricity would bring, and so we do not know what all these connectivity and these applications that are in the pipeline are going to bring. So once you understand that it is really important, not only now broadband per se, but really, adequate fast broadband is needed, and it's going to continue to increase because the applications are, in Southeast Asia and Europe are starting to assume that you have very fast internet, and so if you don't have it, you're going to be stuck on the slow lane there for sure. So that's another way to seeing why this is very important. On the other hand, be mindful as employers, as local government, as community leaders that there is the workforce is changing. And 6 years from now, there's going to be 1 billion digital natives. These are millennials or younger. They're called natives because they have not had to adapt to this. So they will be joining the workforce. So you've got to be mindful of this. They are now a majority of the workforce in the U.S., the millennials or younger. So if you want to retain these workers, you've got to be thinking about allowing some sort of telework or some sort of agreement that makes it really better or easier for them or attractive for them. So keep this in mind, not to mention the digital skills requirements that you need to consider. Another big issue is digital readiness. A study from Pew found that 52% of U.S. adults felt themselves either unprepared, traditional learners, or reluctant in using digital technology. So that is massive. This was, I think, 4 or 3 years ago, so it's kind of outdated, but still it really indicates that we need to focus on digital skills and digital literacy as equally as important as is to focus on broadband infrastructure only. So there are issues to this digital age. Chips and batteries, they're a big issue right now, especially batteries. Cyber attacks, you're going to be hearing more and more about this. Big Brother issue of, is Facebook really looking, does it know me better than my spouse, right? There are studies that say they do actually. Or, is the federal government, sneaking around and kind of looking at my stuff? And profitable privacy is another big issue because the business model of all these tech companies is really advertising. So they're slicing and dicing your data and selling it. So we've got to really, really ensure that we address these issues. But the number one that we're starting to see is inequality. Let me give you an example of what I mean with this. So in 2006, YouTube was sold for $1.6 billion. It had 65 employees, so that meant about $25 million per employee. 2012, Instagram was bought for $1 billion. It had 13 employees, resulting in 77 million people per employee. 2014, WhatsApp, which is a texting app, was sold by $19 billion. It had 55 employees, resulting in $345 million per employee. So that's really a lot of money that's being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Now, this at the local level, you may not have a lot of leeway, but be mindful that there is an issue about inequality in this digital age. It's accelerating. Another example is Google in 2014, with 38,000 employees, produced $14 billion in revenue. Okay? In the heyday of 1979, General Motors produced $11 billion with 840,000 employees. This really supports that graph that I showed you about manufacturing, how we're needing less and less workers to do that. So inequality, and this is generating a huge inequality issue, that's already being felt now. So be mindful of this when you do your digital inclusion strategies down the road. Okay, so let's shift gears. That's kind of the so what of the digital age. Hopefully this kind of laid the 30,000 feet view of why it's important and why I'm excited that you as community leaders understand this and are starting to work to address the broadband infrastructure issue in your communities. But let's now talk about some key terms in broadband. I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but not too much. But I really want you to be kind of educated in these terms so you can have informed discussions with providers and other community leaders, or you know what other people are talking about when you hear them. So the first one is obviously bits are the ones and zeros. It's the baseline of every digital thing. It's the basic unit of information, right? A kilobit is 1,000 bits per second, right? A megabit is 1 million bits per second, and then a gigabit is 1 billion bits per second. So when you hear about internet speeds, you're going to be hearing about 3 megabits per second or so, or 4 or 5 or 20, whatever. That's what this means, okay? It's the amount of bits, which is the basic unit of information, is moving through that pipeline. Download is the speed measured in bits that your computer receives data. Okay, so that's important. And then the upload is the speed measured in bits that your computer sends data. So this is important to distinguish because many times what you hear a lot is only about download, but upload is equally important, especially for businesses that are producing things. Okay, so keep that in mind. So a symmetric speed is one where a provider offers comparable upload and download speeds. Typically, download speeds are way faster than upload speeds. And if you are going to make an investment in your broadband networks or with the providers, et cetera, I would encourage you to make any effort you can to make that a symmetric service where download and upload speeds are comparable. Okay. Otherwise, it's really like you're going on one way, you're going down a 6-lane highway, and then on the other direction, you're going on a dirt road. That's really what this is amounting to. More key terms: the middle mile. You're going to be hearing about this. You may already know about this, but this is the network section that connects that last mile to the backbone of the internet. So that's why it's called the middle mile. It's like the middleman, right? You have all the backbone of the internet over here behind you, then you have this middle mile. These are typically rings, right, that go around a city, either connecting, police departments and hospitals and schools and whatever. That's the middle mile. And then the last mile is that connection between the middle mile and the consumer, right, which would be the home or the business. This is the most expensive part of any broadband project, is that last mile connection, is bringing that connection from that middle mile out into the business or the home. Okay, FTTH is fiber to the home. It means that last mile connection is actually fiber. There is also FTTP, which is not here, but that's fiber to the premise. So that means that fiber may stop at the edge of your neighborhood, and then it's being pushed through coax into your home. This is also good. The speeds are decent, they're good, but just so you know, FTTH is fiber to the home, which actually your home is being connected with fiber. WISPs, you're going to hear a lot about the big broadband providers, but WISPs are really important, especially at the local regional level. These are wireless internet service providers. I'm going to get into the difference between wired and wireless shortly. And then open access of any broadband network means that really anybody, in theory, could benefit from that fiber, right? From that network. Most of the networks are what's called proprietary, so they are being used for a single purpose, and they're not quote unquote open, meaning that somebody else can come and tap into it. That's what I get from many communities that tell me, well, I know there's fiber going down that road. You know, it's servicing the hospital. Why can't we use that? It's because the way that the fiber was agreed upon, it was that it was only going to service the hospital. And I'm oversimplifying, but just to make a case. So there are two types, 2-layer, 3-layer. You can see there what's going on, but that's the open access model. Then dark fiber is, there's a lot of it out there. It's fiber that's in the ground that's not being used or lit. Lit refers to that because you beam light through the fiber. So that's why it's not lit, meaning it's not being used. Okay, they may light it up in the future. Whomever owns it, if it's an open access, they may open it up and lease it to multiple providers. There's multiple ways, but dark fiber, that's what it refers to. It's fiber in the ground, but it is not being used or lit. Okay, so how do we define broadband? I always ask people, okay, what's broadband to you? And I always get different responses from different people in the same room. So let's look at it. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, defines broadband as internet access that is always on and faster than dial-up. Boom, that's it. That's their definition. Well, what exactly does that mean? So then the FCC went in and defined broadband. On top of this definition, they added a speed component, a speed threshold, which is what you're going to hear a lot more about. And obviously different broadband technologies, which I'm going to cover shortly, offer different speeds. But what does that mean? What does this speed threshold mean? Well, the current definition, or one of the current definitions of broadband, means that a broadband service is considered broadband when it has download speeds of at least 25 megabits per second and upload speeds of 3 megabits per second. Notice that that's not symmetrical, but that's how the feds define it. Other areas or other programs funding specifically within the FCC define broadband as 10 megabits down and 1 megabit up. So there's a discrepancy there. But this is what it means when people tell you 25.3 or 10.1. That's what they're referring to, is that it means that's the broadband threshold. That's what they would consider a broadband service, is if it meets those speeds. It would be nice if it would be 25.25, right, symmetrical, but it's not the case. So how can you kind of grasp this? Imagine that 1 megabit per second is 1 mile per hour, right? So if your provider is selling you 10 megabits per second, that means you're doing 10 miles per hour. So with 10 miles per hour, you're doing Netflix, online banking, you're doing social media, blah, blah, blah. So imagine what you could do if you had 1,000 miles per hour, would be the equivalent to 1 gigabit per second. And that's what some sort of cable technologies can offer, but fiber for sure can offer 1 gigabit, even symmetrical, right? 1 gigabit one way and 1 gigabit the other way. So that's kind of the analogy I use to kind of explain what these speeds upload and download mean. So what are the broadband technologies? Well, there are a couple. Digital subscriber line, which runs through the copper lines, the telephone lines, right? That's called DSL. There's multiple versions of it. There is symmetrical, there is asymmetrical, and there are other types. But that's generally one type of broadband technology, DSL. Then we have cable modem. These, your cable providers may offer it, and this one runs through the coax, right, into your home. That's another type of broadband technology. Then, of course, we have fiber optic, which I've mentioned before. Then we also have fixed wireless. So the difference between, I'm going to get to that. Fixed wireless, it's obviously an antenna that is beaming the signal to a line of sight, and then that's kind of what works. Now, many people tell me, well, that's going to solve everything, right? If we can beam everything wirelessly, it's done. Well, what they don't realize is that every wireless signal needs to be wired eventually, and so you've got to reach wires. The more you beam back and forth or bounce off wireless, eventually it's got to be wired. So that's why wired is important. And then we have satellite, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but that's another of the broadband technologies, is the satellite option. Then we have broadband over power line, which is very popular in Europe. Not so popular here, but that's also another broadband technology that is out there. There are but these are the most important ones. So there's an important thing about fixed broadband and mobile broadband. You're going to hear about that. So mobile broadband refers to your smartphone, really, where the consumer or the user is moving, right? It's mobile. So it doesn't matter where you go, as long as there's signal, you are being mobile. And so as long as you have signal, you're going to be using, the internet. So that's mobile broadband. Fixed broadband is when the consumer is fixed, right? When the signal, and maybe wireless, but it's aiming at your home and your home is not moving, right? Or your business. And so that's an important distinction to make. Fixed broadband versus mobile broadband, okay? So here I'm going to talk about some deployment models quickly. Now these are distinguished for sake of discussion, but in real life they typically overlap, so be mindful of that. One is the private sector, right, where large providers provide the service, the WISPs, the telephone cable, these are the ones, that's the private sector. They go out there and they deploy broadband. The public-private partnership, called P3 as well, that one is kind of a combination. There are multiple examples. I'm going to highlight one in Amen, Idaho, which is getting a lot of attention, where the city built out the broadband and then made it open access, and then through improvements in software, multiple providers can offer service to a single home through that open access fiber, right? So a home, instead of having one option, now has 3 or 4. Cost went down and quality went way up. South Bend is doing did something similar here in Indiana. So there are multiple ways to do that, where maybe a private company comes in and it makes it open access, and then it leases it to to other private companies to provide the actual service. There's multiple combinations, but there's a public-private partnership deployment model. Then you have the municipal one, which is not very popular here in Indiana, but it's one that exists in other parts of the country, especially Nashville, Tennessee. The electric company utility started building out fiber to improve its metering and other stuff, and they ended up offering to businesses and others. And then cooperatives, right, or those are in Minnesota. They are offering a big chunk of broadband to rural communities. These cooperatives, again, these are distinct, just so we could talk about them, but in practice they really overlap a lot. But these are kind of the big 4 broadband deployment models that you may want to discuss with the private sector, public-private partnership, municipal, and co-ops. Here's an open access arrangement, for example, where somebody builds the owner of the network, somebody builds it, somebody puts it in the ground, and then perhaps that owner is the same as the operator of the network, right, which gives it maintenance and all that stuff. And then you have the retailer, which is the one that actually offers the service, offers the connectivity, right, and then the end users. And many times you may have the first 3, owner, operator, and retailer are different entities, or many times they're the same one. For example, Comcast, they typically own, operate, and retail all 3, the same as Verizon and AT&T and others. That's one example. But the open access arrangement means that sometimes the owner and operator open up the network, and then multiple retailers come in and offer their service. Because remember that the number one cost is to dig, burying the fiber or the broadband technology. So that's a really, really expensive feat, especially in rural areas, as density becomes lower and lower. The barriers, here we go. These are the 5 main ones. Lack of density, obviously. The less crowded it is, it's going to become more expensive for the provider to build out there, so you've got to be creative and try to find a way. The return on investment is inexistent. Simply the math does not work. So, for some providers, right-of-ways can make it really expensive. Easements can make it really expensive as well. And then the topography. I do know that broadband providers have a hard time going over or under railroads. So, for example, if you have a lot of railroads in your community, be mindful of that. So these are kind of the barriers to that. And I would add another bullet point, which is lack of leadership at the community level. Every solution for rural communities has come from a group of local champions that really push this issue through and find a way to resolve it. and get their community better wired. Lastly, I'm going to share some resources that we have here in-house. This is a digital divide index. It shows a score that considers socioeconomic factors as well as infrastructure, adoption at the neighborhood level. It's very good to jumpstart conversations. You can see the URL there, and you can go check it out more. The Digital Ready Businesses, it's a brand new Purdue Extension community development program that we're launching that helps rural communities, rural entrepreneurs, and rural businesses kind of, improve their online presence and remain competitive in the digital age. And then lastly, we've been doing some regional, what we call the State of Broadband reports, where we identify the 25-3. At this point, you should know what 25-3 means, the footprint, and we also overlay some information as well as some digital economy trends as it's being measured now. So in summary, you have access and affordability, which is important. Then you have adoption and use, and then all these together are digital inclusion, and they together lead to community economic development. If you overlook one, then you're going to have a harder time to improve the quality of life of your residents. So I think that's the last slide, Eric. I tried to breeze through. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A, maybe a little bit